In the final days of war, a Prussian general refused an order to burn his division's records. He believed his men deserved accountability, even in defeat. Hours later, he rode toward the Soviet line and vanished into the smoke of collapsing empires. No witness survived to speak his name. No document recorded his fate. For 40 years, the forest at Mladeko kept its secret until an archivist in Prague opened a file marked only "one officer, high rank, deceased." Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The candle flame bent sideways as another distant explosion shook the walls of the farmhouse. General-Lieutenant Gustav Hunt sat alone at a wooden table, his fingers tracing the penciled lines of a tactical map spread before him. The map was 3 days old. The positions it showed no longer existed. Outside, in the courtyard of what had been Opava Sector headquarters, sentries stamped their boots against the cold. It was April 18, 1945. Spring had arrived in name only. The air still carried the metallic bite of winter, and the ground remained hard beneath a thin layer of mud. Hunt adjusted his spectacles and read the field report again. Soviet armor had been sighted north of the Oder crossing. The 57th Infantry Division, under his command, held a defensive line that stretched 40 kilometers with fewer than 2,000 combat-effective men. Ammunition reserves were calculated in hours, not days. He made a notation in the margin of the report and set down his pencil. The room smelled of damp plaster and stale tobacco. A clock ticked somewhere in the darkness beyond the candlelight. At 2200 hours, a dispatch rider arrived. Hunt signed for the sealed envelope and dismissed the man. He opened it carefully, his expression unchanging as he read. The first order, transmitted from Army Group Center, directed him to organize a counterattack along the Opava-Ostrava corridor. Hold the line. Deny the Soviets access to the industrial heartland. He folded the paper and placed it to his left. 40 minutes later, a second rider appeared. This dispatch bore the stamp of Berlin. Hunt broke the seal. The message was brief. Withdraw all available forces toward Austria. Preserve mobility. Avoid encirclement. He set the second order beside the first. For a long moment, he stared at both, his hands resting flat on the table. The candle burned lower. The artillery fire continued, a low and rhythmic percussion that had become indistinguishable from silence. Captain Lenz entered the room without knocking. He carried a field telephone, its cord trailing behind him like a lifeline. Hunt glanced up. Lenz spoke quietly. Communication with Corps headquarters had been intermittent since dawn. The lines were damaged, the relay stations overrun or abandoned. Hunt nodded and returned his attention to the map. He drew a single line across the paper, marking the probable Soviet. Advance by morning. Then he extinguished the candle and sat in darkness, listening to the war move closer. The observation post overlooked a valley that had once grown barley. Now it grew nothing. The fields were churned black, cratered by shells, and the farmhouses that dotted the hillside stood roofless and silent. Captain Lenz stood beside Hunt at the edge of the tree line, both men holding binoculars to their eyes. Below them, columns of Soviet armor moved slowly westward, their tracks grinding through the mud. Lenz counted 12 T-34 tanks, 6 self-propelled guns, and an uncounted number of infantry carriers. He lowered the binoculars and made a note in his field book. Hunt watched without speaking. The morning of April 19th was grey and cold. The sky pressed low over the ridge. Behind them, a radio operator crouched beside a damaged transmitter, trying to raise divisional headquarters. Lenz turned to Hunt. The general's face showed neither alarm nor resignation, only the methodical patience of a man accustomed to incomplete information. Lenz asked if they should withdraw the forward companies. Hunt shook his head. Not yet. The position still offered observation over the valley. Observation was the only advantage they retained. The radio operator spoke suddenly, his voice tight with frustration. The transmission was breaking apart. Static overwhelmed the words. Hunt crossed to the man and knelt beside him. He took the headset and listened. Through the interference, he heard fragments of a voice, probably Corps, possibly division, ordering a status report. Hunt keyed the microphone and spoke clearly. 57th Infantry Division, Opava Ridge. Enemy armor advancing in strength. Request clarification of. The line died. The operator tried to re-establish contact, adjusting frequencies, tapping the battery connections. Nothing. Hunt removed the headset and handed it back. He dictated a written message to Lenz. The captain copied it quickly. Enemy movement confirmed. ammunition critically low, awaiting orders. Hunt signed it and instructed Lenz to send a runner. If the radios had failed, the old methods would suffice. Messengers on foot or horseback, orders written on paper and carried by hand. Below them, the Soviet column continued its advance. Civilians were moving too, visible as scattered dark figures threading between the ruins. An old woman pulled a cart. A man carried a child on his shoulders. They moved without haste, as though the war were a weather pattern they had learned to navigate. Lenz folded the message and placed it in his dispatch case. He asked Hunt if there was anything else. Hunt looked once more through the binoculars, then shook his head. They descended from the ridge as the first raindrops began to fall, turning the road beneath their boots into a slow river of black mud. The farmhouse at Mladeko served as field headquarters because it still had walls. Most of the surrounding structures had been reduced to stone and timber skeletons. Hunt arrived shortly after noon on April 20th to find Major Bremer waiting in the front room. Bremer wore the insignia of an SS liaison officer. He stood with his back to the empty fireplace, his leather coat unbuttoned, his cap held under one arm. Two younger men in similar uniforms stood near the doorway. They did not speak or move. Hunt removed his greatcoat and hung it on a peg. He acknowledged Bremer with a brief nod. Bremer returned it and gestured toward the table, where a sheaf of papers lay scattered across the wood. The orders were explicit. All divisional records were to be destroyed. Maps, operational logs, personnel rosters, everything that might provide intelligence to the enemy was to be burned before withdrawal. Bremer's tone was formal, almost cordial. He explained that these instructions came directly from Berlin and applied to all commands in the sector. Hunt listened without interrupting. When Bremer finished, Hunt asked a single question. Who would assume responsibility for maintaining operational continuity if all records were destroyed? Bremer smiled faintly. Operational continuity was no longer relevant. The objective now was denial. Prevent the enemy from exploiting captured documentation. Hunt picked up one of the papers and examined it. The order bore an official seal, but the signature was illegible. He set it down and looked at Bremer. He stated calmly that he would not comply. The division's logs contained casualty lists, supply inventories, and communications records. Destroying them would erase the accountability owed to the men who had served. He would preserve what he could for eventual surrender or transfer. Bremer's expression did not change, but his voice hardened. This was not a matter for discussion. The orders were clear. Hunt repeated his refusal. He spoke without raising his voice, his hands resting on the edge of the table. Bremer studied him for a moment, then turned and exchanged a glance with the two men at the door. He collected the papers and folded them carefully. He told Hunt that decisions of this nature carried consequences. Then he left, his men following. Lieutenant Müller had been standing in the adjacent room. He entered after Bremer's departure and asked if there would be repercussions. Hunt shrugged slightly. Perhaps, perhaps not. The front was collapsing faster than any internal enforcement could follow. But Müller later wrote in his affidavit that Bremer's men did not leave the area. They remained near the headquarters throughout the afternoon, smoking cigarettes and watching the road. Their presence felt deliberate, though no further confrontation occurred that day. Evening settled over the forest encampment like ash. Hunt sat on a wooden crate outside the command tent, a kerosene lamp burning at his feet. He had taken a sheet of paper from his dispatch case and now held a pen above it, hesitating. Around him, the sounds of the camp were muted. Sentries moved along the perimeter. Somewhere beyond the trees, a vehicle engine coughed and died. The division was scattered across a 5-kilometer stretch of forest, fragmented into company-sized groups that communicated by runner and maintained cohesion through routine rather than command. Hunt began to write. His handwriting was precise. The letters formed with care despite the cold that stiffened his fingers. He addressed the letter to his wife. He did not begin with reassurances or apologies. Instead, he wrote only what was true, that the situation had deteriorated, that communication with higher command had ceased, and that he did not know when he would next be able to send word. He paused and listened to the distant rumble of artillery. It was closer now than it had been at dawn. He resumed writing. He told her that he had done his duty as he understood it, that he had refused certain orders he believed to be wrong, and that whatever followed, she should know he had acted according to his conscience. The letter filled half a page. He signed it, folded it carefully, and placed it in an envelope. He wrote her name and their address in Munich on the front. though he had no means of posting it. The envelope went into his breast pocket. Captain Lenz approached, carrying a dispatch. Hunt read it by lamplight. A supply convoy intended for the division had been intercepted 20 kilometers to the south. No further deliveries were expected. Ammunition reserves were now calculated in rounds per man rather than crates per company. Hunt acknowledged the report and dismissed Lenz. Alone again, he extinguished the lamp and sat in darkness. Above him, the branches of the trees swayed in a wind that carried the scent of smoke and wet earth. The shelling intensified shortly before midnight. Hunt did not move. He listened as the shells fell closer, their impacts shaking the ground beneath his boots. Eventually, he rose and walked into the tent, where he lay down on a camp bed without removing his coat. He did not sleep. He waited for morning, and when it came, he prepared to ride toward the sound of the guns. At 8 in the morning on April 21st, Hunt stood beside his horse in the clearing that served as the command post. The animal was old, a requisitioned farm horse pressed into service months earlier. Its breath steamed in the cold air. Captain Lenz and another staff officer waited nearby, both holding map cases and sidearms. Hunt checked the saddle straps, then mounted. He settled into the saddle with the ease of long practice, though his movements were slower than they had been in earlier years. Lieutenant Müller emerged from the command tent with a logbook under his arm. He approached Hunt and asked for final instructions. Hunt told him to maintain the current positions until new orders arrived. If no orders came, Müller was to use his judgment. The younger man nodded and stepped back. Hunt turned the horse toward the forest path that led northeast, toward the forward line. The two officers followed on foot. As they departed, Müller opened his logbook and made a notation. 0830 hours. General departed to forward sector. The path wound through dense stands of birch and pine. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the horse's hooves sank slightly with each step. Hunt rode in silence, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. Artillery fire continued sporadically, the sound muffled by distance and foliage. After 15 minutes, the group encountered a squad of infantry moving in the opposite direction. The men stepped aside to let Hunt pass. Their uniforms were mud-stained and torn, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Hunt asked their sergeant for a status report. The man replied that his position had been overrun at dawn. Soviet infantry had penetrated the line in at least 3 locations. He was withdrawing to regroup. Hunt thanked him and continued forward. The path narrowed. The sounds of battle grew louder, small arms fire now mixed with the deeper percussion of tanks. The two officers exchanged glances but said nothing. At 1100 hours, the shelling intensified suddenly. A salvo of artillery rounds struck the ridge to the north, throwing up columns of dirt and smoke. The horse shied, and Hunt brought it under control. Another salvo followed, closer this time. The concussion knocked branches from the trees. The officers shouted something, but their voices were lost in the noise. Hunt dismounted and took cover behind a fallen log. The bombardment continued for several minutes, then ceased as abruptly as it had begun. When Hunt looked up, the path ahead was obscured by smoke and falling debris. He did not remount. He moved forward on foot, leading the horse by the reins. The two officers followed. They walked into the smoke, and the forest swallowed them. The testimony came years later, filtered through memory, and translation. Farmer Janek, a Czech villager who lived near the forest, told the authorities in 1947 what he had seen that morning. He had been sheltering in a root cellar beneath his barn when the shelling began. When it stopped, he emerged cautiously and looked toward the ridgeline. Through the smoke, he saw movement figures in grey uniforms moving through the trees. One man stood apart from the others. He wore a long coat and white gloves, visible even at a distance. Janek could not say with certainty that this was the German general, but the bearing suggested rank. The man moved deliberately, without hurry, as though inspecting the ground. Janek dropped to the earth and covered his head. When he looked again, the smoke had thickened, and he could no longer distinguish individual figures. He heard shouting in German, then in Russian. Small arms fire crackled through the trees. By the time the firing stopped, Soviet soldiers were advancing across the field. Janek retreated into the cellar and remained there until nightfall. When he finally ventured out, the forest was silent. He saw no bodies, no equipment, only scattered shell casings and torn branches. He reported what he had seen to the local Soviet command, but they showed little interest. The front was moving rapidly westward. Individual casualties were not documented in detail. Janek was told to return to his farm and stay clear of the military zone. He did not speak of it again for 2 years. When German families began filing tracing requests through the Red Cross, his testimony was recorded by a Czech liaison officer and forwarded to the Bavarian Missing Persons Bureau. The report noted the location, the approximate time, and the description of the officer in white gloves. It was filed alongside thousands of similar accounts, fragments of memory that might or might not correspond to any particular missing man. No recovery operation was possible. The area remained under Soviet control, and access was restricted. The forest grew over the scars of battle. By 1948, the undergrowth had reclaimed the paths where Hunt had ridden, and the exact site of his disappearance was lost to the tangle of birch and pine. On April 23rd, Soviet forces completed their occupation of the Opava sector. Red Army engineers established a forward command post in what remained of the village. Field kitchens were set up. Supply trucks arrived carrying rations and ammunition for the continued push westward. A medical detachment moved through the area, collecting wounded from both sides. The senior officer, a lieutenant whose name was never recorded, noted several casualties requiring immediate transport. Among them was a German officer found near the forest line, gravely wounded by shrapnel. The medical log, later recovered in fragments, listed the man only by rank. One officer, high rank, possibly general grade. The entry noted severe injuries to the chest and abdomen. Treatment was attempted in the field, but the officer died before reaching the evacuation hospital. The body was placed with others awaiting burial. Personal effects were collected: a leather map case, a wristwatch, a pair of white gloves stained with blood. These items were logged separately, but the paperwork was incomplete. The name field remained blank. The effects were stored in a crate marked for processing by rear echelon intelligence, but the crate was subsequently mislaid during the reorganization of supply depots. The burial itself was hasty. A shallow grave was dug in the forest, and the body interred without ceremony. No marker was placed. The location was noted in a field sketch, but the sketch was filed incorrectly and later lost among thousands of similar documents generated during the final weeks of the war. Lieutenant Müller, who had remained at the command post, learned of Soviet activity in the area through civilian informants. He attempted to send a patrol to search for Hunt, but the request was denied. The division was in full retreat, and resources could not be spared for recovery operations. Müller recorded in the divisional log that General Hunt's status remained unknown. He added a note that Soviet forces had occupied the forward sector and that no German personnel had returned from the area. The log was among the few documents preserved when the division formally surrendered on May 7th. By May 9th, when the war in Europe officially ended, Hunt's name appeared on the preliminary casualty lists as missing in action. His last known location was listed as Mladeko Forest, Opava sector. No further details were available. The summer arrived, and with it, the slow machinery of post-war administration began to turn. In Munich, in a small office cluttered with tracing requests and Red Cross forms, Frau Hunt began her search. The house in Munich had survived the bombings, though windows on the upper floor remained boarded. Frau Hunt sat at a kitchen table covered with papers. It was July 1945. Outside, the city lay in ruins, but the work of reconstruction had begun. People moved through the streets with purpose, carrying bricks and timber, clearing rubble. She had received no word from her husband since his letter of April 20th, which had never been posted. That letter remained in his breast pocket when he rode into the forest. She did not know this. She knew only silence. The Red Cross had established a tracing bureau to help families locate missing soldiers. Frau Hunt filled out the required form with careful handwriting. Name: Gustav Hunt. Rank: General Lieutenant. Unit: 57th Infantry Division. Last known location: Opava, Czechoslovakia. Date: April 21st, 1945. She signed the form and submitted it to the local office. A clerk stamped it with a reference number 284/1945 and told her it would be forwarded to Geneva. She asked how long the process might take. The clerk did not know. Thousands of such requests were being processed. She should expect a response within months, possibly longer. Frau Hunt thanked the clerk and left. She walked home through streets where entire blocks had been reduced to foundations. Children played in the rubble. An old man swept the pavement in front of a bakery that no longer had walls. She kept the carbon copy of the tracing request in a wooden box on her dresser. Each week, She checked with the Red Cross office, but no new information arrived. The form had been logged, transmitted, and filed somewhere in Switzerland. It joined a vast archive of absence names without bodies, questions without answers. At night, she sometimes took out the box and reread the carbon copy. The paper was thin and already beginning to yellow at the edges. She traced her husband's name with one finger, as though the act of touching the letters might bridge the distance between certainty and hope. The city around her began to rebuild. Crews repaired the bridges. The trams resumed limited service. Life reasserted itself through necessity, not choice. Frau Hunt returned to work as a schoolteacher, instructing children in a classroom with half its roof missing. She spoke to no one about her husband. She waited. The International Committee of the Red Cross maintained its headquarters in Geneva, in a building that had witnessed the aftermath of 2 wars. By 1946, the tracing division occupied 3 floors and employed dozens of clerks, whose sole task was to match names on missing persons lists with names on prisoner of war rosters. The Soviet Union had submitted partial lists of captured German personnel. The lists were incomplete, often lacking ranks or unit designations. Many entries consisted only of surnames and approximate dates of capture. The clerks cross-referenced these against the thousands of tracing requests, arriving daily from Germany, Austria, and across occupied Europe. A junior clerk named Bachmann drew the assignment of processing requests related to the Opava sector. He worked methodically, comparing the Red Cross forms against the Soviet submissions. Most names yielded no match. Some appeared multiple times, creating confusion that required weeks to resolve. A few matched exactly, and those families received notification that their missing had been located in prisoner of war camps deep in Soviet territory. Hunt's name appeared on Bachmann's desk in March 1946. The clerk checked it against the available Soviet lists. No match. He then consulted the supplementary records camp rosters, hospital admissions, burial registries. Still no match. He prepared a negative response and mailed it to Frau Hunt's address in Munich. The letter stated that no information regarding Generalleutnant Gustav Hunt had been found in the available records. The search would continue as new. Data became available, but families should understand that many missing persons might never be traced. Across Europe, similar letters were being sent by the thousands. The war had displaced millions. Entire divisions had vanished into Soviet captivity. Others had died in the final chaotic battles, their bodies buried hastily or not at all. The apparatus of documentation had broken down in those final weeks, and what remained were fragments, scraps of paper, oral testimonies, memories growing less reliable with each passing month. Frau Hunt received the letter in April. She read it twice, then placed it in the wooden box with the original tracing request. She did not cry. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded, staring at nothing. Outside, spring rain fell on the broken city, washing ash from the ruins into the gutters. The Bavarian Missing Persons Bureau operated from a municipal building in Munich that had once served as a courthouse. By 1947, its halls were crowded with families seeking information about fathers, sons, and brothers who had not returned. In August, Lieutenant Müller appeared at the Bureau's intake desk. He had been released from American custody and was living in a displaced persons camp south of the city. He carried no documents except a worn military identification card and a handwritten account of his service with the 57th Infantry Division. A clerk ushered him into an interview room. The Bureau maintained files on missing officers, and Hunt's name was among them. Müller was asked to provide any information he could recall about the general's final days. Müller spoke slowly, pausing frequently to gather his thoughts. He described the collapsing front, the contradictory orders, and Hunt's refusal to comply with Major Bremer's directive to destroy the division's records. He explained that Bremer had been an SS liaison officer, that his men had remained near the headquarters after the confrontation, and that the atmosphere had been tense. The interviewing officer asked if Müller believed Bremer or his men might have been involved in Hunt's disappearance. Müller hesitated. He stated carefully that he had no direct evidence. He had seen Bremer leave. He had not witnessed any violence, but the timing troubled him. Hunt had vanished within hours of defying the SS officer. The testimony was transcribed and added to Hunt's file. At the bottom of the transcript, the clerk added a notation: statement unverified, no corroborating witnesses available. Müller left the bureau and returned to the displaced persons camp. His account circulated quietly among former members of the 57th Division, most of whom were scattered across occupied Germany. Some recalled the incident with Bremer. Others remembered only that Hunt had ridden toward the front and never returned. The file remained open. Families continued to submit inquiries. The Bureau responded with standardized letters, acknowledging the requests but providing no new information. The trail had gone cold in the forest outside Opava, and no amount of testimony could recover what the war had taken. By the end of 1947, the Bureau's workload had grown unmanageable. Clerks worked in shifts, processing hundreds of cases each week. Hunt's file was moved to a storage cabinet, where it joined thousands of others, awaiting resolution that might never come. Spring came late to the Opava Valley in 1948. Farmer Janek returned to his fields, which had lain fallow for 3 years. He hitched his plough to an old draft horse and began turning the soil, working in slow, parallel lines across the slope. The plough blade struck something solid. Janek stopped and knelt to investigate. Half buried in the earth was a leather map case, its surface cracked and discolored by moisture. He pulled it free and brushed away the mud. The case was military issue, its buckles corroded but still intact. Janek opened it carefully. Inside were the remains of papers, field orders, mostly illegible from water damage. One sheet, folded tightly, had been partially protected. He unfolded it and saw faint handwriting, a date, and a set of initials stamped at the bottom, G.G. Janek carried the case back to his farmhouse. He examined it more closely by daylight. The initials were clear, though the rest of the contents had deteriorated beyond recovery. He knew that German families were still searching for missing soldiers. He decided to report the find to the local authorities. A Czech liaison officer arrived the following week. Janek showed him the map case and explained where it had been found. The officer photographed the case and the surviving documents, then took possession of the items for forwarding to the appropriate agencies. The discovery was recorded in the regional archive. Copies of the photographs were sent to the Red Cross in Geneva and to the Bavarian Missing Persons Bureau in Munich. The map case itself was catalogued and stored in a municipal warehouse in Opava, where it remained among unclaimed wartime artifacts. Frau Hunt received notification of the find in June. The letter included a description of the map case and a photograph of the initials. She confirmed that her husband had used such a case and that the initials matched. The letter offered condolences but provided no definitive answers. The discovery suggested that Hunt had been in the area, but it did not confirm his fate. The map case became another fragment in the accumulating archive. Its discovery reignited inquiries from other families whose missing had last been seen in the Opava sector. The Red Cross added the information to Hunt's file. The bureau in Munich updated its records, but the forest kept its silence, and the truth remained buried beneath years of undergrowth and forgetting. In 1949, the International Committee of the Red Cross facilitated a document exchange between the newly established German Federal Republic and the Soviet Union. The purpose was to reconcile prisoner of war lists and identify those who had died in captivity. The Soviet submission arrived in Geneva in November, thousands of pages containing names, ranks, dates of capture, and, where applicable, dates of death. The documents were divided among several clerks for processing. Each name was checked against the existing tracing requests. Buckman, now a senior clerk, supervised the operation. He worked through the night shifts, comparing lists under the yellow glow of desk lamps. The process was tedious and often frustrating. Many Soviet entries were incomplete or illegible. Others contained obvious errors, misspelled names, incorrect units, impossible dates. Hunt's name did not appear on any of the lists. Buckman checked and rechecked, running his finger down columns of surnames beginning with H. He found Hunderts and Hunts, but none with the rank of General Lieutenant, none matching the unit designation or the date. He prepared a supplementary inquiry to the Soviet Liaison Office, asking specifically about high-ranking officers captured in the Opava sector in late April 1945. The response arrived 3 months later. The Soviet authorities stated that records from that period were incomplete due to the rapid advance and the chaotic conditions of the final battles. They could neither confirm nor deny the capture of any specific individual without more detailed information. Buckman drafted another negative response to Frau Hunt. The letter acknowledged the ongoing efforts, but stated plainly that no new information had emerged. the case remained unresolved. The files were reorganized and transferred to long-term storage. By this time, the immediate post-war crisis had passed. The focus shifted from tracing the missing to settling estates and providing support for confirmed widows and orphans. Unresolved cases like Hunt's were maintained in the archive, but received less active attention. In Geneva, the building where the tracing division worked underwent renovation. Entire floors of documents were moved to a warehouse outside the city. The work of remembrance continued, but it had become routine, a bureaucratic function, rather than a humanitarian emergency. The urgency faded, though the grief did not. On a cold morning in January 1950, Frau Hunt entered the Munich probate court. She carried a folder containing all the correspondence she had received over the previous 5 years, Red Cross letters, bureau transcripts, and the photograph of the map case. The courtroom was nearly empty. A judge sat behind a raised bench, reviewing documents. A clerk recorded proceedings in shorthand. Frau Hunt was called forward and asked to state her purpose. She requested a formal declaration of death for her husband. Under German law, a person missing for more than 5 years could be declared legally dead, allowing the family to settle financial matters and move forward. She presented the evidence: the last known contact on April 20th, the testimony of Lieutenant Müller, the discovery of the map case, and the repeated failures to locate Hunt among prisoner-of-war lists. The judge examined each document carefully. He asked several questions: whether she had received any information suggesting her husband might still be alive, whether there were any witnesses who had seen him after April 21st. She answered no to both. The judge paused, then made his ruling. Based on the available evidence and the absence of any proof to the contrary, he declared Gustav Hunt legally dead as of April 21st, 1945. The decree would be entered into the official record. She was free to settle his estate. The clerk stamped the decree with the court seal. Frau Hunt signed the acknowledgement and received a certified copy. The process had taken less than 20 minutes. She walked out of the Est courthouse into the winter sunlight. The city had been rebuilt around her. New buildings stood where ruins had been. Trams ran on repaired tracks. Life had resumed its rhythms, though the spaces left by the missing remained unfilled. She returned home and placed the decree in the wooden box with the other documents. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to the Red Cross, informing them of the court's decision. She thanked them for their efforts and asked that her husband's file be closed. The letter reached Geneva 2 weeks later. Buckman added a final notation to Hunt's record: case closed by legal declaration. No further action required. The file was transferred to permanent storage, where it would remain for decades, untouched and unread. By 1955, West Germany had established formal mechanisms for honouring its war dead. The Tübingen Memorial Committee was formed to create a monument for officers who had no known graves, men who had vanished in the final battles or died in captivity without record. The committee solicited names from military archives, family associations, and veterans groups. Hunt's name was submitted by a former staff officer from the 57th Division, who had survived the war and settled in Stuttgart. The submission included Hunt's rank, unit, and the circumstances of his disappearance. In September, the committee held a dedication ceremony. A granite monument was unveiled in Tübingen's municipal cemetery, its surface engraved with 1,200 names, arranged alphabetically by rank and surname. Hunt's name appeared in the second column, between those of 2 other generals who had vanished in the East. Frau Hunt attended the ceremony. She stood with other families in the cemetery, listening as a military chaplain read a benediction. The names were recited aloud, a process that took nearly an hour. When Hunt's name was spoken, she closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. After the ceremony, attendees placed wreaths at the base of the monument. Frau Hunt laid a single white rose. She did not speak to the other families. She remained only long enough to see the flowers arranged, then departed quietly. The monument became a site of pilgrimage for families seeking connection to those they had lost. Over the years, fresh flowers appeared regularly at its base. The names, carved deep into the stone, weathered slowly but remained legible. Yet even as Hunt's name was inscribed in memory, questions persisted. A member of the committee, reviewing the supporting documentation, noted the unverified testimony regarding the SS liaison officer. He wrote a memo suggesting that the circumstances of Hunt's death might warrant further investigation, but the committee had no authority to conduct such inquiries. The memo was filed and forgotten. In Czechoslovakia, access to wartime records remained restricted. The Cold War had divided Europe, and cooperation between East and West on historical matters was minimal. The forest where Hunt had disappeared lay behind the Iron Curtain, inaccessible to German researchers or grieving families. The truth, if it existed, remained locked in archives that few could reach. In the autumn of 1959, a schoolteacher in Opava was sorting through materials in a neglected storage room. The room had once served as a municipal archive, but during the war and its aftermath, many documents had been moved, misfiled, or simply abandoned. Among stacks of yellowed papers, the teacher found a folder marked with Cyrillic script. Inside were Soviet military reports from April and May 1945. Most dealt with routine matters, supply requisitions, patrol logs, casualty summaries. One report, however, caught his attention. It was a field report dated April 23, 1945, written by a medical officer. The text described the treatment of wounded personnel following combat operations near Mladeco Forest. Among those treated was a German officer, described as high-ranking, captured in critical condition. The officer had died before transport could be arranged. No name was recorded, but the rank insignia were noted in detail. The teacher did not know what to do with the document. He brought it to the school's principal, who suggested forwarding it to the regional military archive in Prague. The teacher prepared a cover letter explaining where the document had been found and mailed it through official channels. The document reached Prague in December. It was catalogued, assigned a reference number, and placed in a filing cabinet alongside thousands of similar wartime records. No immediate action was taken. The archive's mandate was preservation, not investigation, but the document did not remain entirely forgotten. In the margin of the catalogue entry, an archivist added a handwritten note, possible relevance to unidentified officer burials, Opava district. The note ensured that if anyone ever came looking for information about missing German officers in that area, this document would surface. Years passed. The document lay undisturbed in its folder, waiting. Outside the archive, Europe moved through the decades of reconstruction and reconciliation. The war became history, its participants aging, its memories growing more distant. But the paper remained, a fragment of truth preserved in darkness, ready to speak when someone finally thought to ask. Josef Kral had been a student during the war, too young to fight, but old enough to remember. By 1965, he was a regional historian in Opava, employed by the municipal archive to document local events. His assignment was to catalogue wartime burials and create a comprehensive register of those who had died in the district between 1939 and 1945. He began by reviewing cemetery records, cross-referencing them with Soviet military reports and local testimonies. The work was painstaking. Many burials had been hasty, poorly documented, or entirely unrecorded. Entire grave sites had been lost to overgrowth or deliberate obliteration. In June, while examining accession logs from the Prague archive, Kral encountered the medical report discovered in the school 6 years earlier. He read it carefully, noting the date, the location, and the description of the deceased officer's insignia. He compared these details against his growing database of missing persons. One name appeared as a possible match: General Lieutenant Gustav Hunt. The rank was correct. The location and date aligned with witness testimonies Kral had reviewed. The circumstances capture in critical condition. Death before transport fit the known facts. Kral made a notation in his research journal. The evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. He needed more. He drafted a formal request to the military archive in Prague, asking for access to burial records and any additional documents related to German officers captured in the Opava sector in April 1945. The request was approved, but with limitations. Many records remained classified under security regulations. Kral would be allowed to review only sanitized summaries and certain administrative logs. He accepted the conditions and traveled to Prague. In the archive's reading room, he spent 3 weeks examining documents. Most were routine. Some contained fragments of useful information, patrol routes, prison accounts, burial site coordinates. Gradually, a picture emerged. Soviet forces had indeed captured a German general officer near Mladeco on or around April 21st. The officer had been gravely wounded and died shortly afterward. He had been buried in the forest, but the precise location was uncertain. Kral compiled his findings into a preliminary report. He submitted it to the archive and sent copies to the Red Cross and to the German War Graves Commission. The trail, though still incomplete, had grown warmer. After 20 years, the silence was beginning to yield answers. In 1967, Kral petitioned the Prague Military Archive for expanded access to Soviet wartime documents. The political climate was shifting. The thaw of the mid-60s had created opportunities for historical inquiry that would have been impossible a decade earlier. His petition was reviewed by a committee of archivists and military historians. They granted limited approval. Kral would be allowed to examine certain Soviet field reports, medical logs, and burial registries, provided he signed a confidentiality agreement and acknowledged that some sections would remain redacted. He returned to Prague in March and resumed his work. The documents he examined were heavily marked. Entire paragraphs had been blacked out. Names were often replaced with identification numbers. Dates and locations were sometimes altered or obscured. Despite these obstacles, Kral pieced together additional details. He found a burial registry from May 1945, listing several German officers interred near Mladeko. One entry corresponded to the date and rank described in the medical report. The name field was blank, but the entry noted that personal effects had been collected and forwarded to a processing center in Brno. Kral requested access to the Brno records. The request was denied. The processing center's archives had been destroyed in a fire in 1952, and no copies existed. He made note of the dead end and continued searching. In another file, he found a sketch map indicating approximate burial locations in the forest. The map was crude, hand-drawn, and lacked precise coordinates, but it provided a starting point. Kral photographed the map and brought it back to Opava. He compared it against modern topographical surveys, attempting to identify landmarks that might still exist. Many had changed. The forest had regrown. Roads had been realigned. Villages had expanded or disappeared. But one landmark remained consistent, a small stream that ran through the valley where the fighting had occurred. Kral marked the stream on his own map and highlighted the areas most likely to contain undocumented graves. His work attracted attention. A West German journalist wrote an article about his research, describing the efforts to locate missing officers from the final battles. The article mentioned Hunt by name and summarized the evidence Kral had assembled. Families across Germany read the article with renewed hope, wondering if their own missing might yet be found. In 1970, representatives from the Bavarian Red Cross travelled to Opava to meet with Kral. They brought copies of Hunt's file, including the original tracing request from 1945, the testimony of Lieutenant Müller, and the photograph of the map case found in 1948. The meeting took place in Kral's office, a small room lined with filing cabinets and stacked with boxes of documents. Kral spread the materials across his desk and walked the visitors through his findings. He showed them the medical report, the burial registry, and the sketch map. He explained the gaps and uncertainties, but emphasized that the cumulative evidence pointed strongly toward Hunt. The German representatives listened intently. One of them, a former Wehrmacht officer who now worked with the Red Cross, asked about the possibility of exhumation. Kral explained that permission would be difficult to obtain. The site lay in a protected forest area, and the Czech authorities were reluctant to authorize excavations without compelling justification. Nevertheless, the visitors pressed. Families had waited 25 years for answers. If there was even a chance of recovering remains and achieving proper identification, the effort should be made. Kral agreed to petition the local government. The Red Cross representatives returned to Munich and began organizing support for the proposal. They contacted the German War Graves Commission, which had expertise in locating and exhuming war dead. They also reached out to veterans associations and family groups, building a coalition that could bring pressure on both German and Czech authorities. By late 1970, Kral had received preliminary approval for a site survey. The survey would be limited to non-invasive methods, ground-penetrating observations, photographic documentation, and witness interviews. If the survey yielded promising results, a formal exhumation request could be submitted. In Munich, newspapers reported the development. Frau Hunt, now in her 70s and living in a small apartment near the university, read the articles with mixed emotions. She had long ago accepted her husband's death. The court decree of 1950 had provided legal closure, but the possibility that his remains might be found and properly laid to rest stirred something she thought had settled. She wrote a letter to the Red Cross, expressing her support for the effort. She asked only that, if remains were identified, she be notified before any public announcement was made. The request was noted in the file. The War Graves Commission survey began in May 1972. A small team of specialists travelled to Opava and met with Král, who guided them to the forest area identified in his research. The team included a surveyor, a forensic archaeologist, and a liaison officer from the Czech military. The forest had changed considerably since the war. Trees planted in the 50s had matured. Underbrush obscured the ground. The stream still ran through the valley, but its course had shifted slightly over the decades. Using Král's map and the Soviet sketch, the team marked probable burial zones. They conducted visual surveys, photographing soil disturbances, and noting areas where vegetation patterns suggested previous excavation. The surveyor used basic instruments to measure elevations and create a detailed site plan. After 3 days of preliminary work, the team recommended a limited excavation. The most promising site was a slight depression approximately 200 meters from the stream, in an area that matched the coordinates from the Soviet burial registry. Permission was granted in September. The excavation began under careful supervision. The team worked slowly, removing layers of soil and cataloguing everything they found: shell fragments, corroded metal, pieces of fabric. At a depth of 1 meter, they uncovered human remains. The remains were fragmentary, consistent with burial in loose soil for nearly 3 decades. Alongside the bones, the team found metal insignia, 2 oxidized pieces that, when cleaned, revealed the outline of oak leaves. They also recovered fragments of uniform braid, silver in color, and a section of collar tabs with remnants of silver threading. The insignia were consistent with the rank of General Lieutenant. The team photographed everything in situ before carefully removing the items for laboratory analysis. The remains were transported to a facility in Prague for examination. A forensic specialist compared the bone structure and dentition against available medical records. Hunt's army file contained a brief dental notation from 1939, recorded during a routine physical examination. The specialist found similarities, particularly in the upper jaw, but acknowledged that the evidence was not definitive. Without modern identification methods, absolute certainty was impossible. Nevertheless, the circumstantial evidence was strong. The rank, the location, the date, the testimony all pointed toward Gustav Hunt. The War Graves Commission prepared a preliminary report concluding that the remains were most likely those of the missing general. The findings reached Munich in November 1972. The Red Cross contacted Frau Hunt, informing her of the discovery and the tentative identification. She was invited to review the evidence and provide input on any further steps. She travelled to the Red Cross office and examined the photographs. The insignia fragments meant little to her. She had never paid close attention to her husband's uniform details. But the fact that they matched his rank, combined with the location and circumstances, convinced her that the remains were his. She asked what would happen next. The representative explained that the remains could be reinterred in Germany if she wished, either in a family plot or in a military cemetery. Alternatively, a memorial marker could be placed at the forest site in Czechoslovakia. The decision was hers. Frau Hunt considered the options. Her husband had died in the forest. Perhaps that was where he should remain. But she also wanted something tangible, a place she could visit. She requested that a marker be placed in Opava and that a small memorial service be held there, open to anyone who wished to attend. The arrangements were made. In June 1973, a simple granite stone was placed near the excavation site. The inscription read, "In memory of those who fell here, April 1945. Hunt's name was not specifically mentioned, in deference to Czech sensitivities about honouring German soldiers on Czech soil. But those who knew the story understood. A dozen people attended the ceremony. Král, representatives from the War Graves Commission, a few former members of the 57th Division who had learned of the event through veterans' networks. Frau Hunt stood beside the stone, her hands folded, her expression composed. A chaplain spoke briefly about sacrifice and memory. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. Afterward, Frau Hunt remained at the site alone. She knelt and placed her hand on the stone, feeling the roughness of the granite beneath her palm. She spoke no words. She stayed only a moment, then rose and walked back to the waiting car. She returned to Munich and never visited the site again. She died in 1979, her own grave marked with her name and her husband's, though his body lay elsewhere. In 1976, an archivist at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz was cataloguing newly acquired Soviet microfilm. Among the reels was a collection of field reports from the First Ukrainian Front covering operations in Moravia during April and May 1945. The archivist loaded each reel into the reader and scrolled through frame by frame. Most documents were routine supply reports, casualty lists, operational summaries, but one caught his attention. It was a transport log dated April 24, 1945, listing prisoners scheduled for movement to rear area interrogation centres. Near the bottom of the list was an entry. One general officer, 57th Infantry Division, captured 21st April near Mladeko. The name field was marked with a notation, deceased prior to transport, see medical report. The archivist made a note of the frame number and continued through the reel. He found no medical report in the collection, but the transport log confirmed what Kral had suspected. A German general from Hunt's division had been captured and had died in Soviet custody shortly thereafter. The archivist prepared a summary and forwarded it to the German War Graves Commission. The document was added to Hunt's file, providing another piece of corroboration, but the central mystery remained. The transport log confirmed the capture and death, but offered no insight into what had happened in the hours before Hunt was found. Had he been wounded in battle, or had something else occurred, an encounter with Bremer's SS detachment, perhaps, or an act of violence that the Soviet report had not detailed? The questions lingered, unanswerable. The witnesses were gone. Bremer had been killed in the final days of the war. The Soviet medic who had treated Hunt was never identified. The forest where it happened had long since absorbed the evidence. The file was closed again, not for lack of interest, but for lack of any remaining leads. The truth had been reconstructed as far as the evidence allowed. What remained were shadows and inference enough to locate a grave, not enough to fully explain a death. In 1980, the town council of Opava debated a proposal to create a memorial plaque honouring all who had died in the district during the war, regardless of nationality. The proposal was controversial. Czech veterans objected to the inclusion of German soldiers, arguing that the occupation and its legacy should not be forgotten or forgiven. Kral attended the council meeting and spoke in favour of the proposal. He argued that history required honesty, not selective memory. The war had consumed millions, and the dead deserved acknowledgement, not as heroes or villains, but as human beings caught in events beyond their control. He cited his research on Hunt and others like him, men who had fought not from ideology but from duty, and who had paid the price for a conflict they did not choose. The debate grew heated. Some council members supported Kral's position, emphasizing the need for reconciliation. Others remained opposed, fearing that honouring German soldiers would dishonour Czech suffering. The vote was postponed pending further community consultation. The controversy attracted media attention. Czech and German newspapers covered the debate, framing it as a conflict between memory and forgiveness. Families of missing German soldiers wrote letters supporting the memorial. Czech survivors of the occupation wrote letters opposing it. The issue became symbolic of larger questions about how nations remember war. Ultimately, the council approved a compromise. A memorial would be erected, but it would honour only civilians and identified soldiers, with no specific mention of nationality. The language would emphasise shared loss, rather than individual names. Hunt's story, and others like it, would remain part of the historical record, but would not be inscribed in stone. Kral accepted the decision, understanding that memory itself is a kind of battleground where the past is continually renegotiated. His work had achieved what it set out to achieve, recovering truth from silence. How that truth was remembered would always be contested. He returned to his office and resumed his research. There were other missing persons to trace, other families seeking closure. The work continued, slow and patient, guided by the belief that even incomplete answers were better than none. In the spring of 1988, Kral completed a comprehensive article summarizing his research on German casualties in the Opava district. The article was published in a regional history journal with limited circulation, read primarily by academics and local historians. The piece detailed the methods he had used, the sources he had consulted, and the conclusions he had reached. Regarding Hunt, Král wrote, based on available evidence, including Soviet medical reports, burial records, and recovered insignia, it is most probable that General Lieutenant Gustav Hunt perished during capture operations north of Opava on April 21st or 22nd, 1945. The exact circumstances remain unclear, but no evidence supports theories of execution or internal violence. His death appears to have resulted from combat injuries sustained during the final Soviet offensive. The article included photographs of the documents Král had uncovered, the excavation site, and the memorial stone. It concluded with a reflection on the challenges of historical research in politically sensitive areas and the importance of preserving memory, even when that memory is painful or ambiguous. The publication generated modest interest. A few German newspapers reprinted excerpts. Families who had followed the case wrote letters, thanking Král for his work. Some veterans of the 57th Division sent personal accounts, adding minor details to the historical record. Frau Hunt did not live to see the article, but her daughter read it. She wrote to Král expressing gratitude for his dedication. She mentioned that her mother had kept every document related to her father's disappearance, and that those papers had been donated to a local archive in Munich. Perhaps, she suggested, they might be useful for future research. Král acknowledged the letter and made a note to contact the Munich archive. There was always more to learn, more connections to uncover. History was not a single narrative, but a web of stories, each thread leading to others, the pattern emerging only gradually over time. He filed the correspondence and turned his attention to the next case. Outside his window, the forest that had concealed Hunt's fate for so many years stood green and silent under the spring sky. The path through Mladeko forest had been maintained as a hiking trail. By the late 1980s, visitors occasionally came to walk among the birch and pine, unaware of what had occurred there decades before. The granite stone placed in 1973 remained, though moss had begun to grow in the carved letters. No flowers were left regularly now. Frau Hunt was dead. The veterans who had known Hunt were dying. The memory was fading into history, preserved in archives and journal articles, but no longer carried by living witnesses. In Munich, the wooden box that had held Hunt's correspondence was eventually donated to the city archive, where it was catalogued and stored alongside thousands of similar collections. Researchers studying the war's final months would occasionally encounter Hunt's name in footnotes and bibliographies, a minor figure in a vast catastrophe, notable only for the persistence of those who sought to learn his fate. The Tübingen Memorial still bore his name among the 1200. On certain anniversaries, ceremonies were held there, attended by aging veterans and their descendants. The names were read aloud less frequently now, the list too long, the audience too small. In Opava, Král continued his work into his 70s. He never found definitive proof of what happened to Hunt in those final hours, but he had reconstructed enough to satisfy the requirements of history. A man had served. A man had disappeared. A man had died. The details were fragmentary, but the outline was clear. The forest itself remembered nothing. Trees grew where men had fallen. Streams ran clear over ground once churned by battle. The war had passed through like a storm, violent and transformative, and then the world had moved on. Only in documents and fading memories did it persist. Names on paper, photographs yellowed with age, testimony recorded and filed away. Hunt's story became what all such stories become, an echo, a footnote, a lesson about the cost of silence and the limits of remembrance. The war had taken him as it had taken millions, swallowing him into chaos and leaving behind only fragments for those who came after to assemble into meaning. The wind moved through the birch trees at the edge of the forest, rustling leaves that would fall and be replaced, season after season. The stone marked a place, but the place no longer corresponded to memory. Those who had stood there in April 1945 were gone. The fear they felt, the choices they made, the moments that defined their lives all had dissolved into the past. What remained was the work of historians, archivists, and clerks who had preserved what they could. The Red Cross forms, the tracing requests, the testimonies, the photographs, these were the residue of loss, transformed through documentation into something that might be studied and understood, if not fully recovered. Hunt's disappearance had been one among millions, but for those who sought him, his wife, his former comrades, the historian who pieced together his final days, it had been singular. Their efforts had turned absence into narrative, silence into story. The story was incomplete, as all such stories are, but it existed. That was enough. In the end, what could be said? A general had refused an order he believed to be wrong. He had ridden toward the sound of battle, and had not returned. He had been captured, wounded, and had died. His body had been buried without ceremony, his name recorded incorrectly or not at all. For decades, he had been lost. Then, slowly, through the patient work of those who believed the past mattered, he had been found, not recovered, not restored, but found. His name had been spoken again, his service had been acknowledged. The questions surrounding his death had been examined, if not fully answered. The war had ended more than 40 years before, but its silences continued to speak. Each time a file was opened, each time a witness was interviewed, each time a grave was located, the past reasserted itself, not as living memory, which faded with each passing year, but as history imperfect, fragmentary, but enduring. The forest stood where it had always stood. The stone remained, and somewhere in an archive, in a folder marked with his name, Gustav Hunt's story waited, preserved for a future that would know even less of what he had lived through, but might yet understand what it meant.